Welcome to the Clause YouTube channel.
Together, we strive for a safer, secure, and more stable world.
Good evening, everyone. Welcome to Strategic Frontlines, the official YouTube channel of Clause. And today we are privileged to have with us Mr. Ajit Ranade. He was the Group Executive President and Chief Economist with Aditya Birla Group. He has been member of executive committees of FICCI and has also served on several committees of RBI. He is the newspaper economic columnist and co-author of award-winning book Rising to the China Challenge. I welcome you, Mr. Ranade, to this podcast.
Thank you.
Today we are going to discuss the economic issues, especially about US tariff, the GST 2.0, and India's economic growth trajectory to become a Viksit Bharat by 2047. So my first question is on the US tariff. We know that tariff had climbed from 25 to 50%, and the Indian exports to the US has also dropped by over 22% till August this year. However, there are reports that suggest that US may cut its penal tariff to 10 to 15%. So, Mr. Ranade, what is your take on the whole tariff issue? Is the situation going to improve, or you think do we need to diversify? And if so, with what countries? We are already working with the EU, but what are the other countries? And second question I want to ask you is, do you feel that Trump's take on China in his second term is very different than the first one? So is there some strategy behind this? So both these questions, over to you.
Thank you, Dr. Roshan, and thank you for having me on this podcast. The first question was about the outlook for the tariffs. Now, you see, Mr. Trump is pursuing very, what should I say, harsh policy on trade. The expectation that he and his team have is that by imposing high import duties, high import tariffs, they will generate some revenues, which will then be used as fiscal resources or tax refunds. So that is broadly the line of thinking, I think. But what has been, said, there's a big report by Goldman Sachs which says that 80% of the burden of these tariffs will be borne by the US importers or the customers. You see, the tariff is actually paid by the importer and the importing company, and then it is passed on to the customers. And overall, if you look at the overall burden of the tariff, it is estimated that 70 to 80% of the burden will be borne by the US customer. So there will be an inflationary impact. Of course, exporting countries like India will face lower demand. And as you said, the August data shows that there's been a dip in the demand. But I think sooner or later, if the Trump administration recognizes and understands that the tariffs are hurting the US customers in terms of their inflationary impact, there might be a rethink. So you asked me to anticipate what do you think is going to happen to the tariffs. It's difficult to predict accurately, but there was a statement made by the chief economic advisor to the finance ministry, Dr. Nageshwaran, who said that by end of November, he expects at least the penal part, it was 25 plus 25, the penal part to go, and perhaps it will come down to not just 25%, but maybe, as you said, 15%. We'll have to wait and watch. In the meantime, we have to diversify our export markets. And this, of course, the Trump tariffs have perhaps acted as a trigger, but we should be anyway diversifying as a prudent strategy. Over dependence on one export market is anyway not healthy. While the US is the biggest consumer in the world, consumption spending is among the highest in the world, and it's a very big consumer market. But let's not forget that the second biggest economy in the world, which is China, their consumer market is something like $7 or $8 trillion. And India's exports do not even have a 0.1% market share there. Surely, if we increase our market share to say 1%, it'll be like a huge increase of our exports. Now, I know that exporting to China is not that straightforward, not easy. There are barriers. But we must acknowledge that 100 other countries, 120 other countries are exporting to China. Surely they're doing something that we can emulate. And then, of course, not to forget the large European market. The growing frontier is now Africa. Africa is, of course, there are 54 countries, and together they constitute something like $4 trillion. And it's growing 6 or 7%. It's also growing. It's a young demography. So we cannot ignore that from a future potential. So I think this Trump tariffs have made us look very closely and intensively at what are the export destinations, and we cannot, of course, do without export. Exports are a very important driver of economic growth, so we have to continue to strive for that. Your second question was the Trump administration or President Trump's approach to China. There seems to be a difference, you're right, that when he took office in 2017 January, one of his first decisions was to impose steep import duties on steel and aluminum mainly. And this he did from the national security angle, which is Section 232. But this was turned down by the WTO. And then it went into appeal, and I don't know what the status there is. But this time, he is actually, the duties imposed on imports from China are actually lower than India. Surprisingly, India is facing a 50% import duty barrier, but China is facing less. Of course, if you add back the Section 232 tariffs, perhaps it is also higher. But somehow the approach to China seems to be a little more cautious. There have been meetings or dialogue, I think, the communication between the US and China. China suddenly reduced its import of soybean from the US down to zero this year. And that's had a pretty significant impact on farm exports of the US. So China has got more leverage. They have withheld the export of rare earths, which are critical for electric vehicles and technology. So that also has an impact. So China has leverage in terms of critical things that the US, either they are export market for soybean and beef, agriculture products, or they are also exporters of critical minerals or rare earths. So China has more leverage. So I think Trump's approach has been a little more cautious. But let us not forget, and let us not ignore the fact that all of this strategy, trade policy being used as an instrument of geopolitics, is driven by a desire for geopolitical containment of China. That we cannot, I think that we are fairly sure that the geopolitical aim of US is somehow to have containment, and trade policy is being used as an instrument. How this is playing out, of course, we will watch this as it unfolds.
Spoke about the containment of China for the US. If US thinks about that isn't it better that India becomes an alternative for that, because India is a growing economy. So in future, it would be better if US and India had better trade relationship. So first question is, and second, I wanted to ask you recently stated that we need to diversify our trade. And you rightly pointed out that China is one area. But the balance of trade when we see with China is very one-sided. We do not export too many things. So according to you, what are the sectors where we can export more to China? And can we also do the same in other Asian countries?
Yeah, so your first question is regarding that China plus one. Back in 2017, around that time, when the first presidency of Trump, at that time people said, oh, China is going to be seen as a risk factor because the Trump administration is becoming adversarial. So maybe American companies will start relocating outside China, and at least some of their investment will go into places like India. We saw a lot of investments moving into Vietnam, for example, or maybe Mexico. But to that extent, we have not seen a big rush of investments moving into India. So, that is 8 years ago, or last 7, 8 years, we've tried to attract investments of companies who are trying to de-risk or diversify their risk out of China. The one big success story, of course, in smartphone manufacturing. We have seen that a leading company like Apple is producing a large, very huge volume of smartphones, and our total export of smartphones has gone up significantly this year. So that is an example of a success that we have been able to set up a base. And as far as the US is concerned, see, US exports are mainly now, agriculture products, but we have drawn a red line there. It's not as if they can't sell soybean to China, that they will sell it to India, because for India, agricultural imports are a red line. In fact, those were the 3 or 4 items on which the trade negotiations between India and USA stalled. For example, we do not want to import dairy products from USA.
Absolutely.
We do not want to import corn, maize, or even for ethanol. We do not want to import GM products, genetically modified products. So I don't know. You can't say that. Of course, the US is interested in pushing more oil, crude oil, and energy products to India. Of course, they are interested in pushing more sale of defense. But given the situation with these the penal tariffs, and now this more recent decision of imposing $100,000 of a fee for H-1B visas, which predominantly basically is targeted on India, we cannot be seen as easily giving away in the negotiations of saying yes to defense imports. We have done some, we have committed some. So we'll have to see. Of course, the US and India trade relations should improve, and historically, not only in trade, ever since we signed the Indo-US civil nuclear deal, it has been a very strong relation. In fact, as you know, the US under President Bush took the leadership to bring India out of the nuclear apartheid. So we have a good foundation there, but we'll have to negotiate our way out of these recent developments. Your other question was about exporting to China. As I said, our trade is asymmetric. You're right. Our exports are something like $16-17 billion, but our imports are 100 billion, 110 billion. Surely we can increase our exports. Now, we have to learn from other countries what are they doing that we can also do. As I said, more than 100 countries are exporting to China, maybe more primary products. So we have to find from our range of products, at least we should make a dent, I think. And as part of India-China negotiations, because we are now opening up, I believe, Chinese investments is going to be slightly liberalized, and India-China trade continues to climb. For the last 5 years, is going up. So we have to use those negotiations to find out how we can get a bigger foothold, a bigger entry into Chinese. I think we cannot ignore that large consumer market.
I think this question now leads to another question, and that is the domestic economy. Recently we know that GST 2.0 was announced, and it was quite successful. The major benefits from it, we find that the essential commodities have become cheaper, tax rates have been streamlined, and there is procedure simplification. But do you feel that the government will also lose significant tax revenue and may face short-term fiscal stress, and especially the states fear that significant losses they may incur, and they have asked for more sector-specific GST bans. So what are your views on that, and if you can elaborate that little bit?
Yeah, Dr. Roshan, GST was rolled out officially across the country on 1st of July 2017. So this year in July we completed 8 years. And it was the finance minister was Mr. Jaitley back then, and it was a historic reform, which in fact was observed in a special midnight session on 30th of June in Parliament. So what happened? The GST basically means that we have a unified national market with one indirect tax system called GST, Goods and Services Tax. So the way it was achieved was that state governments gave up the right for sales tax, imposing sales tax or VAT, and the central government, the union government, gave up its right to tax excise duty as well as service tax. Now, to get the states on board, the deal was that the states would be compensated for any revenue shortfall because of GST, and that was part of the initial legislation, part of the GST bill which was passed in 2017. But that guaranteed compensation, which was shortfall of revenues, and it was a very generous 14% guarantee, that ended in 2022. Okay, that was called the compensation cess, and that ended. Now we have these reforms because we found that GST 1.0, despite being a historic reform, had some very significant drawbacks. There was multiplicity of rates, and the classification of goods into different rates was confusing or led to disputes, litigation, leakages. For example, the famous example of if popcorn was salty, then in one rate, and if it was sweet, in some other rate, or biscuits with cream biscuits in one and non-cream, and so on and so forth. So it badly needed simplification. It was also the system had initial glitches because especially small businesses, micro, small, and medium enterprises, MSMEs, had difficulty, a lot of difficulty in complying with the taxes and online filing of taxes and all that. So a lot of simplification was necessary, and many people had made representations to the government. So under Finance Minister Nirmala Sitharaman, as you know, the GST rates and policies are decided by the GST Council, which consists of finance ministers from all the states of India and the Union Finance Minister. So it is a inclusive consultative process. So the GST Council in its 56th meeting, I think on 2nd September or 3rd September, that they made a historic decision of doing away with two of the rates. So from 4 rates, we have come down to 2 rates. It used to be 5, 12, 18, 28. So the 28 and 12% brackets were dropped. So now we have only 2 rates, 5 and 18. And that simplification is going to be really very helpful. And the other good news is that most of the items which were in the 12% rate were moved down to 5%. So now the tax paid on those goods, especially a lot of consumer items are now in 5%. And a lot of the items which are in 28% have moved to 18%. Prominent among them are things like cement, bags, cement, which is very critical input in housing and infrastructure, and also cars, small passenger cars. So having a lower tax is a pretty major boost. And don't forget that in February, the Union Finance Minister in her budget had already given an income tax relief, in the sense of now up to 12 lakhs, any Indian earning income up to 12 lakhs, the 12 lakh rupees, first 12 lakhs is completely tax-free, free from income tax. So we have had 2 major boosts, fiscal boosts, I would say. Income tax relief in February, and now GST relief in September. So certainly this will go towards boosting consumption. But remember that giving tax relief or cutting down tax rates means that the government will have lesser revenue. And what the government is hoping is that whatever revenue it loses because of lower tax collection or lower tax rates will be compensated by tax which will be collected on the higher consumer spending. The fiscal boost is leading to people going and spending more. For example, now we are in the festive season, so consumers spend more, and if they spend more than their usual pattern, that leads to higher spending, higher tax collection, so better fiscal situation. So it's a net of these two. The tax cut leads to fiscal burden, and the increased consumer spending leading to higher tax collection partly compensates for that. So even then, net, I think there's going to be a fiscal loss, tax revenue loss of, now the estimates vary. They're anywhere between 50,000 crores to perhaps 1 lakh crores. But in an economy which is like 350 lakh crores, 1 lakh crore is not even, 0.3%. So it's a fiscal burden that we can bear. As you said, what about the states? So I think the union government will find a way to compensate the states, because the compensation says that compensation formula ended in 2022. Now, in this new framework, we'll have to find a way that the union government will have to give some support. That is not been spelled out. I'm not aware of that, but I'm sure the finance minister assured that they will safeguard the fiscal health of all the states. She has said it very categorically.
Coming to other area which is linked to this is we know that the government has said about the Viksit Bharat. There are goals for the Viksit Bharat, and we want to become a 30 trillion economy by 2047. And recently, Dr. Arvind Panagaria, he's the chairman of Finance Commission, he had stated that we will be able to achieve so, because he stated that from 2003 to 2017, if we see in terms of nominal dollar term, we had a growth rate of 12%. And even if we take it in terms of real growth rate, if we see, it is 9%. And if we see now, if we take out some COVID years, we will maintain about a 9 to 10% growth rate. And he's saying that the story of our economic growth has been very phenomenal, because there has been transformative areas like the infrastructure, both in terms of transport and digital sectors. And the poverty line has also gone down. But along with this, there are some challenges also. For example, labor and land market reforms, manufacturing sector needs to be strengthened. So what do you make of it? How are we going to achieve this goal? And what are the pluses and what are the areas where we need to work more?
Yeah, Dr. Roshan, see, 2047 is 22 years away. Okay. So what will happen in 2047 will depend on what happens in the next 5 years, and in the next 5 years, and in the next 5 years, and in the next 5 years. So while it's important to have this grand goal and an ambitious goal of becoming a developed nation by 2047, and I think by developed nation is meant that per capita income should be $10,000 or something like that. So it's a very well-defined metric. But to get there, as I said, we have to see what we will do in the next 5 years, and then the next 5 years, and next. So I think if you look at the medium term, not short term to medium term, that will translate. The long term is nothing but a continuation of what we do in the medium term. So for that, we need to, of course, as you said, achieve higher growth rates, which is, by the way, inclusive and sustainable. We can't have growth rate of the economy, which is say 10%, but only a small fraction of the economy is growing very fast at 20%. Rest of the economy is growing at 0%. The average will come out to be 10, right? That's not what we want. We want a growth rate which is high, let's say 7 or 8 or 9%, but which is also inclusive, which means it benefits all sections of society, and it should be sustainable, which means that we do it in a way where it can be sustained in terms of how we use our resources, what impact we have on the environment, and so on and so forth. We have committed ourselves, for example, to net zero carbon by 2070. So we cannot pursue an economic growth strategy where we keep on increasing our carbon footprint. So we have to do it with keeping that in mind. I think one thing is clear to me, that our growth rate will depend critically. Our growth ambition for Viksit Bharat will depend critically on significantly increasing the share of manufacturing in our GDP, which is currently 17-18%. It has to go up to 20, if not 25%. And secondly, more importantly, we have to strengthen our whole base of producing human capital, which is our trained workforce, with training, skilling, education, and productivity, which means that we have to have a heavy focus on how the entire education system. As a nation, we are spending, whatever, 1 or 2 to 3% on our education system. We have to increase that spending, because that is the foundation on which the future growth will come. It will come because we are entering into an age of much more knowledge intensive, much more digital footprint economy, and now artificial intelligence. So it will require a workforce which is ready for it. For that, we need the education system to be beefed up, to be ready in terms of contemporary curriculum, future-oriented curriculum, quality of teaching, quality of research, quality of productivity increases, apprenticeships, young students getting jobs as apprentices, on-the-job learning, learning by doing. All this will be very important. So two things. One is to increase the share of manufacturing, and secondly is to really solidify the foundation of our education. I think these are critical.
We know that the service sector is doing very well, and you pointed out that the manufacturing sector needs to increase. So, what particular manufacturing sector you feel we should improve? I mean, and what are the environment which should be available for the MSMEs to work on it? Do you think it is a mindset kind of a thing, or is it if we provide what you rightly pointed out at the base level, if we have better skilled labors, then the things will automatically become better, and people will be more adventurous to become go into more production sector rather than just assembling sector. Your views?
Yeah, see, services sector are doing well, no doubt, but they are not large employers. See, one manufacturing job creates about 5 or 6 service sector jobs. It's not vice versa. So the manufacturing jobs have much more potential in multiplier impact on employment. So when you said what can we do, I would say across all sectors, whether it is textiles or engineering or electronic assembly, or I mentioned smartphones or pharma or say chemicals. Please remember that 30 to 40% of our manufacturing industrial output comes from MSMEs. 30 to 40% of our employment comes from MSMEs. 30 to 40% of our industrial exports come from MSMEs. So if we want this manufacturing sector to be really energized and made vigorous and growth and inject growth in it, we don't have to only think of very large employers, very large manufacturing companies. We have to actually focus on what is it that will make MSMEs prosperous, more productive, and that's where we have to recognize what are the constraints they face. I think they face 4 constraints. Number 1 is capital. While they contribute 30-40% in terms of employment, output, and export, but they don't get 30 to 40% of bank credit. So they have difficulty in raising capital, whether from banks or equity. Second, technology, access to technology. It remains out of reach or unaffordable. Third is market access. That is, small MSME is typically, how do you give them access to large markets? Most MSMEs who are, they cater to 1 or 2 clients. But with e-commerce, you can open them up for customers across the country or beyond the borders. And fourth is access to talent. So capital, then technology, access to markets and talent. So these are the 4 things that, and we also of course have to make the processes simple. So ensure, like I mentioned in the context of GST, that the burden of compliance of taxation and other things should not be excessive. I think we have recognized that. We have an exclusive dedicated ministry for MSME at the union government level, and almost every state of India has an MSME ministry. But just by having ministry doesn't mean we have solved the problem. But if you genuinely look at these 4 constraints that I've said, I think we'll go a long way.
You really pointed out very nicely the things what we need to work on. So if you agree, we'll take few questions. We have got few questions. This is by Dushyant Singh. He's the DG clause. He says GST 2.0 also has provisions for defense procurements. Can you throw some light on that, and what will be the impact on the economy? And he also says, okay. Yeah, first we'll take that question. So,
yeah, nice to hear from Dushyant Singh. Thank you for your question. Actually, as you know, many of our peer countries and countries which are unfriendly to us and so on, their defense expenditure is going up. I mean, some of them are looking at 5 to 6% of GDP. Even the European NATO countries, some of the countries who are traditionally not so focused on defense, their defense spending is also going up. So India will have to look at increasing its defense spending. I think we are at 2%, I think. So defense spending has to go up. What it means in terms of defense procurement policies, I think, of course, the relief on GST the reduction in rates will be beneficial, both for the buyer and the sellers, purchasers. But in general, I think the broad message is, of course, that One is that defense budgets need to be beefed up, including the balance of capital spending, machinery and as against capital items as against consumable items or only personnel. And secondly, the dependence and involvement of many, many more private sector players. I'm happy to say that Pune, where I am based, I'm a senior fellow with the Pune International Center, is increasingly becoming a very significant hub of defense production, not just public sector but private sector. And I think recently in the newspapers there was a full page write up about how Pune defense industry is developing. One of the largest defense suppliers in the private sector is from Pune. I think it's this. Hopefully, the GST regime is just a shot in the arm.
Yeah, Jan Singh was supposed to join today, but he had a conference, so he got late in that. Another question is by Govind. He says, how can GST 2.0 simplify compliance for small and medium enterprises while ensuring revenue buoyancy for states?
See, the compliance has been made easy because the classification now is only in 2 rates. So I think that itself means that you don't have to worry about classification, confusion, or disputes. And there is some simplification of the returns also, the various forms that you have to fill out. And hopefully there will be some relief for MSMEs. I'm told that it's possible that your filing can be not monthly but quarterly, but please consult your tax consultant for this. And I also feel that there is one more element where they can make it easy, because very small entrepreneurs, they find that sometimes they miss the deadline by 1 or 2 days and they have to pay the penalty. Otherwise, your entire business is stopped. So they have found from data which has been collected over the last many years that the amount collected in those penalties is so minuscule, so small, that perhaps the time has come for at least small companies below a particular threshold. You should just give them a slightly higher grace period. We are not condoning, but if you apply one rule to all, imagine a Tata, Birla, Reliance having the same rule as a very tiny company. The tiny companies unfortunately struggle with compliance, and the penalties they pay can be waived off. And this is proved by data. They're not collecting much penalty, but it's a big danger for them. So I think these kind of reforms and simplifications are there.
One last question. It is by Yuvraj. And he says, do you think India should retaliate against American tariffs or focus more on negotiating trade deals?
No, when you say retaliation, you really have to think about what leverage we have. We have written a book on Rising to the China Challenge, which Dr. Roshan mentioned. It was published in 2021. I'm happy and proud to say that we won an award for that. But there, the main message was what we call strategic autonomy and strategic patience. So we have to just keep focus on how we can get higher, inclusive and sustainable growth, which requires a lot of domestic policy action. We call them, as Dr. Roshan yourself mentioned, and you quoted Dr. Panagaria on land and labor markets and other, So there's a lot of work to be done domestically. I think we should just use the Trump tariff shock as a blessing in disguise to accelerate some of the reforms that need to be done domestically. And as far as dealing with the US is concerned, just be patient, because I told you that the impact of the tariffs is going to be on US customers. Sooner or later, there's going to be some backlash. The midterm elections, which will come up in the US in 2026, is where the Trump administration and the Republican Party will have to really think, whether they can keep pushing something which is damaging the US interests. Even the H-1B visas, I am told that is going to lead to more outsourcing, which is opposite of what Trump and the MAGA people, Make America Great Again, people want. If that is going to lead to more outsourcing of jobs outside the shores of the US, and it is going to lead to sharp decrease in the students who go from India to study in America with taking large loans, then it is counterproductive. If they realize that, then hopefully they will revise those policies. So we just have to be patient. I don't think we have too many levers like China to retaliate. So therefore, patience and focusing on domestic reforms and being really serious about it and going much more intensively on ensuring higher, inclusive and sustainable growth is probably the better strategy.
Do you feel that the private sector should do more as far as research and R&D is concerned?
Well, it
Because
is true
even
that
the government is trying to improve it, but like in other countries, the public sector has public sector, along with public sector, private sector also has a major role to play. So do you feel
of
that
course,
culture needs to develop?
absolutely. Of course, much of the GDP growth is going to come from the private sector, whether it is exports or manufacturing or even R&D. So we have to find conditions under which private sector, the so-called animal instincts will be enthused and unleashed. If the private sector investments are not happening, we need to examine what are the constraints. Is it a policy constraint? Is it risk aversion? Is it something else? Lack of talent? What is it? And you know, as they say, there's something called in management literature, something called theory of constraints, I believe. So we have to find what is the constraining factor. Just by exhorting them, you know, that alone doesn't work. We have to really find out if there is any policy constraint. We need to address it. Otherwise, is it because of interest rates? Is it because of exchange rate policy? So we have to examine it in detail. But absolutely true that it's the private sector which will lead the country in raising economic growth.
Thank you so much, Mr. Ranade, for elaborating the economics so well, and
Thanks.
viewers for their questions. Thank you so much.
Thank you, and thank you for having me. Thank you, Dr. Roshan.